What is up, YouTube? My name is Ben, and today we are going to break down Chris Bumstead's quad-focused leg day. This is a video that he conveniently posted about 24 hours ago, and many of you in the last video that I did looking into Chris's training said that you wanted to see more of a quad-focused leg day. So today we're going to look into that specifically. Break down some of the movements that he's doing as I have done in previous videos, talk a little bit of how you can make it more individual to you if that's something that you are looking for, and yeah, let's just jump right into it. So Chris kind of starts off his leg days, at least from what I've seen in previous videos, warming up on these kinds of adduction, abduction machines, which I think is a fantastic thing to do for a lot of people. I don't necessarily think that you need to choose a bunch of different motions that are not going to be involved in your regular training to do your warm-ups. I'm typically a fan of just loading the motions that you're going to start with at a lighter intensity, at a lighter weight. But nonetheless, I think the seated adduction machine is a really, really good option for training those adductors. And I also think that because it is a highly neglected motion in most people's training, could be really, really beneficial if you've never actually utilized it before. Starting off here, we got leg extensions. Now, big key with leg extensions that I think most people tend to forget about is what the leg extension provides, rather, that typical squatting patterns don't, is tension toward the fully knee extended or knee straightened position, right? So when that knee is fully straightened, you have a load that is directly pushing you down away from that straightened position, whereas something, like a squat or a hack squat, although they may be really, really good movements from the perspective of training the bent knee position, they never actually provide a significant amount of stimulus, at least, toward that more short position of the quads, specifically the rectus femoris. The rectus femoris is a two-joint muscle, crosses both the hip and the knee, and so it is best trained, or really only efficiently trained, with leg extensions and things like maybe a split squats with the back leg hip being in a static position as the knee moves. So leg extensions, obviously super common exercise for people to do, but not super common to see people taking their time toward the top end of the range, as Chris tends to do, at least from what I've seen in the past and what he demonstrates to some degree here. So other thing I'd say about leg extensions is specifically that you want to make sure that when you're doing any sort of leg extension or even leg curl type movement, that shin is moving in the exact plane of motion, or in the exact direction as the pad is moving. So if you see the specific machine that Chris is using, I believe is actually a hammer strength machine, where the pads are actually angled slightly outward, which is convenient for most people, especially bigger people whose thighs tend to angle outward, as opposed to smaller individuals, more narrow individuals, whose thighs may just naturally be a little bit more straight relative to a normal leg extension pad. So if you're not using a leg extension machine that is angled outward at all, make sure that with that pad moving straight forward and backward, that your knees are rolled in a little bit relative to the point where you have the ability to actually just move your shin forward and backward as opposed to out in any direction. So moving on to some lying leg curls, like I said, I think these are sort of his preparatory movements. I scanned a little bit later in the video, and I believe he's going to be doing hack squats. And so something that I think is a really good strategy, especially for people who tend to be toward the stronger end of the spectrum, is to actually do these more isolated type motions really just specific to the knees, to actually warm up the knees, but also to get a sufficient stimulus out of the quads and the hamstrings, so that when you move to these bigger sort of gross patterns that are going to be much more heavily loaded, you can actually get the same level of muscular stimulus with a lighter amount of weight. So we see this often done with supersets between leg extensions and something like back squats or hack squats, where you sort of pre-fatigue the quads, maybe pre-fatigue the hamstrings to some degree, to where the quads are really, really easy to make a limiter, and so where you basically don't have to use as much load as you normally might if you were to do the hack squat first or the back squat first, whatever it happens to be. So lying leg curl is a great option for training that shortened position of the hamstrings. If you want to see more on the specifics on the lying leg curl, check out the previous video that I posted in regards to Chris's glute ham day. Another big key to the lying leg curl specifically is notice the position of Chris's hands. A lot of people will tend to either be sort of loose with their grip on that, or won't really pay too much attention to what they're doing with their upper bodies. Very, very important that when we're looking at the lying leg curl, we're paying attention to what our hands are doing, and specifically the idea of we want the hands to actually be pulling down, almost like you're doing sort of a lat pull down type motion, to actually not only lock the lats in, but to also create a really, really good counterforce to the pad that's trying to sort of pull you up and off of the seat. So I've seen a lot of people sort of put their elbows and their forearms up on the seat to like do this sort of cobra pose. Not a big fan of that for a number of different reasons, the main of which I would say is just the fact that it's far less stable and you're going to have a much more difficult time trying to actually keep control of your entire body when you're doing it that way. All right, so moving on to hack squats. This is the pre-core hack squat, which I've used a couple of times. I like it a good deal. I do wish that the foot plate, as you can see, Chris's feet like have to be somewhat higher than I think would be ideal for him from a quad perspective. Something like the Cybex hack squat is a really, really good hack squat because the pad, or rather the plate where you can put your feet, is a little bit lower. But nonetheless, it'll be a really solid option. Things that we want to look for on hack squats generally is to get full knee flexion, i.e. to bend the knee fully, i.e. to touch the calf to the hamstring. Now, the range that you're capable of controlling, and obviously this will change from person to person, and whether or not you have injuries or previous knee problems may play into this. But for the most part, we want to end up in a position where toward the bottom of the motion, we're again getting that hamstring flat to that calf, so that we can lengthen the quads fully, or at least the single joint quads, to ensure that we have the most amount of possible length in them, and as a consequence, the most amount of possible tension in that bottom position where our knees are also farthest away from us. So when we're looking at any sort of hack squat or quad dominant type motion, we really, really want to make sure that we are in a position where our knees are not only far away from us, at least from a relative perspective, farther away from us than our hips are, which the hack squat does just because of the constraints of the machine, but also where at the bottom of the motion our knees are fully bent. Again, that hamstring is sort of touching and brushing along that calf. The big advantage to using hack squats specifically over something like a barbell, for instance, is that there's a ton of constraints on really how you're able to move, such that there's pretty much no way that you can really do this movement predominantly with any other tissue outside of the quads. Now, of course, can you move your feet up, and will that potentially be a little bit more of a glute or adductor stimulus? Yes, of course. But for the most part, we want to keep our feet in a relatively lower position on the entire pad frame. And many of you will probably, if you're not able to adjust the foot platform, be better off with a little bit of a toe out angle so that you can sit down in between your hips a little bit more easily. If you want to make this a little bit more of a quad glute exercise, you're going to want to put your feet a little bit more narrow, toes forward. And if you want to make it a little bit more quad adductor, you put your toes out a little bit, maybe stance a little bit wider. But either way, we want to make sure that the knees are tracking in the direction of the toes. And again, at that bottom position, that we're in that fully knee bent position. So moving on to leg press here. Super important that when we are looking at leg press from the perspective of quad training, we want to generally have our feet lower here. So although Chris is probably also looking for some glute ham stimulus and for some glute adductor stimulus, I do think it's important to note that if this were to be an exercise that he would want to make the most amount of quads, he would want to move his feet down on the platform a little bit. And not only down on the platform, but potentially even into like a sissy kind of style where just the forefoot or the front of the foot is on the pad, so that you can actually get your heel pretty close to your butt. I've seen many people do that with a great amount of success. I myself do it when I don't really have any other options and I'm traveling or something like that. But just keep in mind that if we are looking to maximize quad stimulus, we don't want to pick an exercise where, specifically in a leg press, our feet are higher up on the platform. Because again, just look at the amount of knee bend that Chris really gets into at the bottom of the motion. Now, you could also argue, well, he kind of had the full knee bend in the bottom position of the hack squat. And fair enough. I would just say that if we, again, are looking to look at this as a separate option and maybe it's just a standalone option for quads, if you don't have a hack squat, again, a good idea to use the leg press, put your feet lower, and again, maybe opt for a little bit more of a forefoot or toe on the platform stance. If that's something that is comfortable for you, but if it's not, full foot on the platform is no problem. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a great leg press to use that doesn't really fit your structure particularly well, you can always do a ton of different options that will achieve a similar stimulus, right? So something like a split squat, which I believe Chris is about to do here. Yeah, so moving on to Bulgarian split squats, i.e. rear foot elevated split squats. This is going to be, like I said, a really, really solid option for training that same lengthened position of the quad where that knee is fully bent. And as you can see, Chris's hammy pretty much getting on top of that calf, as I mentioned earlier. And also notice that back leg is up on something like a bench. Quick tip for this is that I don't generally prefer people do what Chris is doing here, where they sort of they don't really have the foot contacting anything. The foot is kind of just resting on top of a bench. A lot of people tend to get like weird hip sort of knee issues with that, at least just in my experience. So if that is you, and if you find that it's a little bit uncomfortable, what you can do is just elevate a bunch of plates up onto, you know, a certain height that's good for you, where you can actually have your forefoot on the ground. Or you can just find a bunch of boxes or any other sort of machine that has a pad that you can actually, again, create that foot contact with. So for a majority of people, what ends up happening with the front of the shin on the bench or on whatever you're using is, because we don't have that muscular support, that ability to actually push into the floor with anything, we lose an ability to actually create contraction with our calves and the muscles that surround the shin, which actually cross up and toward the knee to stabilize the knee. So keep in mind that when we're looking at every exercise, it's also important to consider muscles that aren't directly being involved or aren't directly being targeted as the primary moving tissues, because those tissues function in a way where, again, in this specific example, they actually support the joints that are trying to do the most amount of work, i.e. the calf to the knee in this particular situation. So Chris is executing this in a way that's pretty quad dominant. You can see he's keeping the dumbbells pretty close to his hip, and he's also keeping his torso pretty upright. If you wanted to make this probably even more quad dominant, what you could do is you could put something underneath of your heel, and you could actually elevate your heel so that your foot is kind of changed at an angle, so that your foot is actually elevated to where your heel is higher than your toe. And in effect, what that's going to do is it's not only going to actually open up more range of motion at the ankle, but it's also going to allow you to actually push your knee farther forward, so that, again, as I mentioned earlier, not only can you get that full knee bend toward the bottom end of the range, but you can also at the same time make sure that you get your knee a little bit farther away from you. Obviously, that's only necessary up to a point, because we don't want to take the extreme and just try to like turn this into a sissy squat or something like that, where you might be very, very unstable. But just even a 2.5 pound or a 5 pound plate underneath of that heel can make a really, really big difference from a range of motion perspective, especially for people who have relatively longer femurs. So as I mentioned, if you want to make a split squat quad dominant, keep the weights close to your hips, push that knee forward, get that full knee bend. And as you can see, as Chris is doing here really, really nicely, is he's not really locking out toward the top where there wouldn't be a ton of resistance. He's kind of staying in that bottom end of the range, making sure he gets all those partials out toward the end of the motion. And of course, you will get a good amount of hip stimulus with this, or resistance at the hip, regardless of the fact that the knee is the primary moving joint. So just as in all these other exercises that Chris is doing, because they are all mostly involving knee and hip, you will get some sort of glute or adductor hamstring stimulus along with all of those other things. Like I said, if you do have a primary goal in training quads, you want to sort of follow all the rules and tips I listed out already just across most of your exercises. But no one ever really complained about bigger glutes, bigger adductors. I also tend not to think that most people are going to be better off with all this like crazy drop set stuff. I think this is something that he's more so doing because he's with his coach Hani, who likes to torture people that way, which is totally fine. But for a majority of people, you take a set of split squats to failure. Totally fine by me. You don't need to do all the crazy drop stuff unless you're into that. Right, so moving on toward more accessory type stuff. He's moving on to hamstrings, it seems, with the seated leg curl. I kind of covered the seated leg curl in my last video, so I won't go into too much detail if you want to go back and check that out. But just a general tip that I maybe didn't mention in the last video. A lot of people talk a lot about like aligning the knee joint with the pivot point of the machine, right? So if I'm looking at Chris from this perspective here, we want to kind of see from the side point of view that this knee joint is aligned with this axis, i.e. this little circle here that I'm kind of scrolling over with my mouse. That is something that is impossible to have happen from the perspective of the axis of the knee can't technically be aligned with the axis of the machine throughout the entire range, because the axis in the knee actually changes where the motion is actually occurring just because of the structure of the knee joint. So don't be so hell-bent on like aligning things so precisely that way. Just try to focus more on like, okay, where is the pad? Is the pad basically like right below my calf? And do I have enough stability from the thigh pad to where I'm not being pulled out of the seat and to where I'm achieving an adequate amount of range of motion for whatever is appropriate for you? So for me, I just look to get close to the top. If you want to keep it in the hamstrings, you don't have to straighten your knees fully. If you want a little bit of extra calf stimulus, you straighten your knees more. As I said, most of you should try to get to the bottom to where, that pad at least is abutting sort of where that pad can actually get to from the perspective of just the range of motion of the machine. Or if you're a bigger person, it may just happen to be the case that what stops the range of motion is sort of the bulk of your calf hitting the seat on the hamstring machine. So moving on to some seated abductions. These are great exercise, obviously, just for training all the tissues that do abduction, i.e. training the lateral glutes and those deep hip rotators like the piriformis, for example. Not a fantastic exercise for training glute max, as I've mentioned in previous videos, but that's kind of all covered with the leg press type motions and the hack squats and all that. There's sort of a glute stimulus interspersed between all those different kinds of motions that, like I said earlier, there will be some degree of that, even though all these movements are pretty quad dominant. So moving on to this standing single leg hamstring curl. Not a huge fan of this machine, just from the standpoint of it being a little bit less stable than the lying version. Like, I would rather just do the lying version twice if you're gonna try to train this position more than once, as opposed to using a different machine. Recall that it's not necessarily the machine that makes the exercise different. It's the way that the forces are interacting with you in the position that you're in. So that may sound a little bit silly, but overall, really what we're just looking at is like, what is the position of the joints? And if the position of the joints is the same and the force direction is the same and all that, pretty much a similar stimulus, but just in a standing hamstring curl single leg machine. Although it may align a little bit better for some people some of the time, like Chris is a bigger individual, so doing things single leg can be an advantage for that reason, where double leg may be a little bit more uncomfortable. I can see that being a rationale for using it. But then again, you could also just use the lying leg curl and do it single leg as opposed to moving both your legs at the same time. So that's it for Chris's quad dominant leg day just prior to the Olympia. I believe that was his last leg day workout, or at least the last quad day workout before the actual show day. So hope you all enjoyed this breakdown. And if I had to kind of just wrap up with a few thoughts here, a majority of people are going to be just fine training leg extensions, hack squats, pendulum squats, and quad dominant leg press. You don't really have to get very fancy with quad training outside of that. Split squats can be a great option if you don't really have access to some really good machines, or if you just don't want to really load your spine with a ton of weight through a pad or through a barbell or something like that. Many of you may not have access to those kinds of machines, so there are ways to sort of work around the constraints, in those sorts of cases, to which, again, I would recommend something like a quad dominant split squat, again, where maybe that heel is elevated. Or if you're in a situation where you do have something like the Prime Solo wedges, which I love and I think are totally worth the investment, what you can do is you can load up, a quad dominant barbell squat where you're pushing your knees really far forward, because you do have that ability to actually raise your heels to a significant degree. So, all those are great options. Don't overcomplicate the quad training. Leg extensions and squat patterns, bread and butter, and so that's pretty much it for this video, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Please comment below and let me know whose other videos you would like to cover. I like doing these, and I would like to cover more individuals across a variety of topics. Please like, comment, share if you liked the video, and I will see you all in the next one.